Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Do I Know Enough? Navigating the Relationship Between Research and Writing. I'm Lindsay Whalen. I am currently working on my first book, which is a biography of the poet Mary Oliver. I'm here with two biographers who really need no introduction, Candice, Millard, and Kai Bird. I'm so thrilled to be speaking with both of you today. Candice is the author of 3 best-selling books. She's a former Bio Award winner. Her most recent book is Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape, and the Making of Winston Churchill. Kai Bird is a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer and current executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. We're lucky enough to catch Kai just before his brilliant new biography of Jimmy Carter is to be published. The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, goes on sale June 15th. Congratulations to Kai.
Thank you. 6 years.
Very big deal. So exciting. We will have time towards the end of the conversation for Q&A. So I hope that people will submit questions via chat and we'll address as many as we can. I feel like one of the really amazing things about the Bio Conference is that it allows us to ask questions that are really of interest to other biographers. So don't be shy with the questions. This panel was certainly born of my own questions and my own struggles as a first-time biographer to figure out the relationship between research and writing. They're hand in hand, but sometimes they can compete with one another. Sometimes it's hard to answer the question of, do I know enough? You know, can I really start writing? How do I work through holes, and how do I, deal with various questions of research and still feel like I'm making progress on the book? And so Candice and Kai, I thought it might be a good idea to sort of start at the beginning and hear from each of you about how you each approached that gargantuan task the first time, and what you learned along the way. You know, are you still working in that way? Did you really revise from that first process? And take it away. I'm so thrilled to hear.
Kai, you want to go?
Okay, I'll start off with a funny story. On my first biography, which was of a still unknown Wall Street lawyer named John J. McCloy, I signed the contract. This was in 1981, I think. And I didn't start to write for 5 years. And the reason was that I got so sucked into the archives and the interviews. I made a long list of the people I wanted to interview, and I put the people at the top who were the oldest. So Averell Harriman was 93 years old, so I went to see him first. I knew nothing. But anyway, I also, as I began to think about starting to write after 5 years, I began to make long chapter outlines. And I think the first chapter outline took me like 2 months. And the first chapter I actually wrote was like 120 pages about one legal case that John McCloy had worked on off and on for 10 years. And, it was too much. It was much too much. And I never did that ever again. That book took me 10 years to complete. And ever since, I have to confess, and I know Candice will be shocked, I have written all my books without an outline, without a chronology, just sort of winging it. And I don't know how I do it, but maybe you guys can interrogate me and we'll figure out my secrets.
That's impressive. So my first book was The River of Doubt. It's about Theodore Roosevelt on this unmapped river in the Amazon. I was working at National Geographic at the time. And what was complicated for me, first of all, I was terrified. I didn't know if I could actually write a book. But also I got married, I moved to Kansas City, I was pregnant, and I'm trying to, figure it out. And even though my books are not, full biographies, they're slice of life biographies, there's a ton of work that goes into my books. Also take between 4 and 5 years to write, and the writing comes at the very end. So I'm working on I'm almost finished writing my 4th book right now, and things are pretty much the same. I spend the first 3 years doing research, starting with just casting a very wide net, learning as much as I can. There's always going to be a ton of information that you don't end up actually putting into the book, but which really informs your understanding of how you're going to tell it. So everything matters. And so, plus I love it. I'm sure Kai also loves doing research. It's so much fun. You can have a problem. You can go on too long, but there's always another thread to pull. There's always, well, what about, this is interesting, and you follow it, and maybe it's nothing, or maybe it becomes really important to the book. So it's really hard to resist pulling on those threads. And, it's to some degree, you shouldn't resist it, because again, in my experience, some of those things that seem like nothing ended up being, to me, really illuminating about the subject and the time period or these people, or just a kind of a fascinating angle. So I do a ton of research, and then it's a matter of organizing. So I would say, like, the first year doing foundational research, the second year trying to organize it, and finding holes in the research, and then the next year outlining. I spend a ton of time outlining. I spend at least a year outlining the book. Wow. Finding more holes in the research, doing more research until I feel like I'm ready. And if anything, I outline more. So again, everybody's process is different. For me, even though I did outline for River of Doubt, once I started writing, again, the way I write, everybody's different. The way I write, I need to really know how I'm going to tell the story before I start writing, because otherwise I get kind of lost in it. Because when you're writing a biography of any, you're just a massive amount of detail. I mean, Kai has an incredible brain. He can hold. I just can't. I need to be stuffing it away somewhere. I will forget. I can't hold the whole story in my head. I need to have a place where I can write it down and keep moving it around, and it keeps changing. Even after I start writing, I'm changing it. But with River of Doubt, I did have an outline, and I thought I was ready, and I started writing, and right away I just got lost. I'm like, there's just too much detail. It's distracting. I can't remember exactly where I'm going, and it just kind of ground to a halt, and I had to stop and go back to my outline. I want to be able to visualize. I want to be able to clearly see where I'm going. And so for me, that's a critical part of the process. Well, and that's why I think it's really interesting how we have different approaches.
Well, Candice, let me jump in here. Clearly, we both agree that taking on a biography is just an overwhelming thing. You very quickly begin to drown.
Yeah, exactly.
And exactly. So your strategy in dealing with that deluge of water coming down the pipe of information and New York Times articles and interviews, and you deal with it by trying to organize it. And I can't possibly face the fact of writing a whole book knowing that I have to know where the story's going and knowing the whole story. So my strategy, the way I cope with this is to, before I go to sleep at night, when I'm in a writing, after I've finished the first year or so of research and finding my way through the archives a little bit, the research is never done. When I do start to write, when I go to sleep at night, I think, well, what one little anecdote would I like to wake up tomorrow morning and write?
Mhm.
What will be fun to write? What will get me started? And I try to, just sort of fall asleep dreaming about that anecdote. And then the next morning, my only discipline is I get up and I do write that one anecdote. And, it may be only 150 words or 300 words, but it's something. And I do try to write chronologically. And every once in a while, well, all the time you sort of break out of that. But so that's my psychological strategy for getting myself to do what is a horrendously difficult thing, is to write every day.
I
And
like that a lot.
Lindsay will recall that with our fellows, I have this mantra, have you written your 300 words today?
Mm-hmm.
It's not very much, but if it's 300 words every day, it begins to add up.
I really like that you lead with joy and not stress, Kai.
Yes,
You're
I like that.
you're addressing and letting yourself be guided and informed by the pleasure of the project as opposed to the worry of the project. I don't even want to talk about what I think about before I go to sleep at night. but I'm going to try and shift myself more towards your way of thinking. So this is sort of maybe even the same question from a slightly different angle. Like, sometimes the problem I'm really having is like when I'm trying to write those 350 words or that sentence, and I come up against the fact that, oh my God, I'd really love to be able to talk about the weather or, something. And I just, and then like how to either set that concern aside and move forward through it and then address it on the back end, or do you let yourself kind of go off on that tangent and answer that question in order to write the sentence you want to write? I imagine that your approaches to that might be very different also, but I'd love to hear.
I make notes to myself all the time. So all the time, especially when I'm writing, I will think of something, or I'll be looking at a note and that I want to say it's a quote that I want to use in the chapter I'm writing, and I'll see something else. I'm like, oh, I forgot to put that in an earlier thing. I will stop and just stick it in, and it can be ugly, and I can fix it. And a lot of times, I just like do it in boldface so I won't read past it. So I know I need to work on this more later. But if I don't grab that thought and stick it somewhere useful, somewhere I won't forget it. And again, and a lot of times with a sentence, it's kind of similar. If I'm writing and a sentence, it's ugly, it's not working, but it's the idea that I want to get. And it's the idea that is often what eludes us, right? And so it's not, you have to express it well, but it's the idea you're trying to get across. And sometimes I'll stare, I was like, what's the point I'm trying to make? And so if in the moment when I know that point, even though it's not going to come out exactly right, I'll just type it in and then I can massage it later, but I can go back to that. And that's something that I was thinking of when I love Kai's idea of starting with something you enjoy. I think that's so great. I even tell my kids when they're doing homework and they keep putting it off, like, what's the easiest thing? What's the kind of fun just to get the wheels turning, right? And so I think it's the same thing if you give yourself a hook to get started. So for me, when I'm writing and I'll just get going and things are moving, and then I look at the time, I'm like, I've got to leave. I've got to go pick my kids up from school. So whatever thought I was going to, I just, in all caps and boldface, this is what, tomorrow, Candice, note to self, this is what you were thinking. This is what's coming next. Because often that's the hardest thing. You sit down, you're like, oh, where was I or what was I? And then so you're grateful to yourself. Oh yeah, that's it. And then you can kind of get going pretty quickly. So I always leave myself, whenever I have to stop writing, I leave myself something to grab onto to pull myself back into the story the next time I can sit down.
Actually, I do the same thing. If I come across a fact or a little anecdote that I know I missed and it belongs in a previous chapter, I'll go right there and try to do it.
Right.
And when I have to stop for whatever reason, I do try to, well, not stop in the middle of a sentence, but I try to make it clear in writing what comes next, so that exactly the next day you come back and you don't spend 30 minutes sort of staring out the window. What am I doing?
Right. Exactly.
Candice, you talked about this a little bit, about kind of your processing process. We're all dealing with so much information. I have often found, and I know everyone has this experience, when you go to an archive or you're making a site visit or something, and you're so pressed for time while you're there that you can almost barely read what you're looking at, or you can barely really take in what you're seeing.
Right.
Do you find that you kind of build in time to your work life, that as soon as you're back from that archive trip or from that research trip, you're writing out notes, you're trying to write through that information, or is it just kind of waiting there? Are you kind of piling until you get to the point where you're using it and then go to it then?
I think that, as with every aspect of writing, there are no hard and fast lines. Everything kind of bleeds into each other. So usually I'll take one big research trip, depending on, and maybe it'll be two, like the book I'm writing about now, it's about the search for the source of the Nile. And so I did a big research trip several years ago to the UK, several places in the UK. That was largely archival. So, lots and lots of diaries and things like that, letters and stuff, which I brought back here and started to work through. So, and it's the same thing even with secondary sources. You're reading and you're annotating, and so I have everything. So I do read it pretty quickly when I get back. I read it, I annotate. I have, you develop kind of little quirks as you go along. So mine has been, if I see something, interesting, I'll highlight it. Within it, there's certain parts that I really like, I'll even underline those parts. If I think I'll probably use it, I give it a star next to it. If I should definitely use it, I give it 2 stars. If I'd be an idiot and I'm going to furious with myself if I forget about it, I give it 3 stars. So do not forget to use this. And so, it helps me. Again, these are these ways I'm trying to help my future self. And then though, I went to Uganda and Tanzania. In fact, I got really lucky because I went right before everything shut down. So I came back a year ago, March 10th. So I was really, really lucky. So Zanzibar, Kenya, all these places. But that's kind of a different kind of trip. There was a little bit of archival, but that's seeing things. So that's taking a lot of pictures, interviewing people, just trying to understand, just trying to remember, and trying to go there at the same time that they're there, what the weather was like, what the terrain was like, smells, those kind of sensory things that are really coming to help me now that I'm trying to describe these settings. But then with the actual archival stuff, I have a very old school system, so I don't use any kind of software. I just use Microsoft Word. But what I do is I go through, and it takes forever. It just takes forever, but it's a part of the process that I can't skip for me. So I go through all this stuff that I've read, and I can quickly pick out the important parts, right? And I start putting them in files, just Microsoft Word files, thematically. So for instance, my book on Winston Churchill, there's a whole thing about his personality. Okay, so his arrogance. If I'm going to be talking about his arrogance, here's an example. Somebody said, "Oh, that Winston Churchill, I can't stand him. He's so arrogant." I'll put that quote in parentheses where I got it, because you will be so mad at yourself. And I've done this so many times where years later, you're like, I have this great quote. I have this great evidence. Where did I find it? It's just so much. So I try to give myself that, just be really clear exactly where I found it. And it can be, a description of something. It can be a character. It can be an event. And a lot of times evidence has to go 3 different places, right? Because you don't know exactly how you're going to use it. So that takes a lot of time too. That's, to me, in my mind, that's the organizing all the research even before I start the outlining.
So Candice, when you go into the archive, are you taking pictures or? Yeah, and then you come back and you take Microsoft Word notes on the. So
I'll take pictures of all the stuff and just print it out and read it and annotate it. And then when when I'm ready to start organizing everything, I get it back out. But I'm not starting fresh. I at least have already read it. And I've marked it up, and so it moves a little faster.
Well, I confess my system is much simpler.
Everybody should listen to Kai.
I with my iPhone, and I take pictures. And as I take a picture of each document, I take a picture of the box number and the folder. And then I send it to 3 or 4 different subject folders. So it could be Jimmy Carter and the Middle East, Jimmy Carter and Exxon Oil Company. And, one document at the time, I'm making just snap decisions. I've read this document briefly, scanned it, said, oh, this is interesting, I need to copy this. And it's about X, Y, and Z, and I'll create 3 different subject folders. And then I never look at it again until I'm starting to write. And then I know I want to write about oil and Jimmy Carter and the energy crisis. Then I'll go and look at my subject folders on my computer and draw those up and say, oh, that's an interesting document. I completely forgot about it. So my
treasure.
It is organized. I can find things, I can source things, but it's very intuitive.
So Kai, I'm interested. Do you keep it all digital? Like you just keep it all digital. You never print it out, or you're sending it to a digital file. You're reading it digitally.
Right. Well, when I started out, 30 years ago on McCloy and then Bundy, I Xeroxed everything and then would come back, put them in file folders physically.
Right.
Now I'm doing the same thing. And then actually when I am writing, I find it annoying sometimes to try to read some of these long documents on the computer. So I'll print them out. If I know I'm going to be quoting from something at length or consulting it more than once, then I'll print it out and throw it on the floor.
So that was something that I was really curious about with you, Kai, considering, how long you've been doing this. What is the technological change that sort of shifted your process the most? Like what's really been game changing for you?
Really, it was, 2008, 2009 with the invention of the iPhone but I confess it wasn't until I started on my Carter project 6 years ago that I started to realize that I could take digital photos. I don't use a camera, the camera option. I use a Scanner Pro program, which is faster and easier to send the various documents to different subject folders. But you're right, for my McCloy, Bundy, even Oppenheimer, I started on the Oppenheimer book in 2000, but I had a co-author who had been, at that point, Marty Shuron had been working on that book since 1980. So he'd done all the research, most of it. And he had all these archival documents in boxes. And he would occasionally find them in more boxes in his attic or a closet that he'd forgotten about. So every few months I would get more boxes. And it was very old-fashioned. But my last my last couple of books, my books on the Middle East were more reporting books.
Right.
My book on the CIA clandestine officer, Robert Ames, there were no documents to speak of, really. The CIA didn't give me anything. There was very little in the National Archives. So it was mainly based on interviews. And so that was sort of a different project. But Carter was, really, I was drowning for a lot. The first year I spent probably 6 months in the Carter Archives in Atlanta, just taking photographs and on Scanner Pro. And it was exhausting. It was just, and I confess, I was trying to use the time so efficiently that I wouldn't read a whole document. I would just read enough of it to say yes or no. And, I still have, I think, about 20,000 pages on the iPhone and on my desktop computer. And, a lot of those I never ended up using or quoting from directly, but it informs you get educated reading all that stuff.
So that sort of brings up a question to me about dead ends, questions that you have that you can't find the answer to. Sometimes I imagine that even happens when you have the kind of archival sources that you're talking about with Carter, where it's just, an infinite pile, but maybe there's a more intimate personal question that you can't get at or that you don't know how to get at. So I'm wondering if both of you could talk about your experience with that kind of obstacle and whether, whether the answer was that you did find get to the pot of gold, or maybe you didn't and found that you didn't necessarily need it in order to write the book you needed to write.
So for me, I also do a lot of research before I commit to a project. So I haven't had an experience where I've come up to a dead end that really, really matters. That's essential to the story. Because I have spent twice, I've spent a year researching a possible book, and in the end walking away from it because finally, just even though I loved the story and I thought it had so much potential, I ended up feeling like I didn't finally have enough research material, enough primary sources. And so I worried about that. So, with narrative nonfiction, you need a ton of details, not just big ideas, but you need a lot of dialogue. So, you really feel like it's almost a novel, you feel like you're there, you're listening to this conversation. So you absolutely have to have a lot of personal letters, personal diaries, so you can get that dialogue. And you need just a lot of details. So you want the reader to just kind of get lost in the story. And there just are times when I think, there's enough, probably, but not for what I want it to be. And so I've twice walked away from subjects that I was really excited about or stories I was really excited about. So if it's a smaller thing, you can always write around it. You can structure the book around it and figure it out. There are other ways. And then you can also get really creative. And always, I think it's really important to look for kind of non-traditional sources or sources that you wouldn't at first think, like, for instance, when I was working on my book about Churchill and the Boer War, so he's basically embedded with this group, the British military in this town Escort right before he gets captured. And he talks about what he was thinking about and what was going on, but he doesn't really talk about what it was like to be there. What it smelled like, was it raining, was it dirty, what was it like? And I don't even know how I happened to find this this book that a great grandson of one of the soldiers who was there at the same time in the same place with Churchill. this guy had kind of written his memoirs, and his great-grandson had found them in the attic and decided to self-publish them. And I just, luckily, I saw this and I was like, huh, I wonder if there's something. It was just like a, Boer War soldier's diary. And so I thought, I wonder if, and you can get it on a Libris, and it was like $5 or something, And so I got it, and it turns out he was at the same place. And so he talks about, well, there are eucalyptus trees there. Okay, well, now I know what it smells like. Well, and there was this little canvas bathtub that we all use that was falling apart. So I can talk about that. And he talks about the mess tent. So just those details that sometimes can be a distraction. You have to be kind of careful about that. You can go on too long with some of these things, but some of it really make you understand it. It gives so much richness to the basic story of what's happening. So those are the kind of things that you should just always be on the lookout for, and always give it a try. And it goes back to that, pulling those threads. Like, maybe it's nothing, but it's probably worth a couple minutes of your time to look into it, because it could be something really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just following up on what Candice just said about walking away from a project, before tackling Carter, I actually thought I wanted to do Reagan. And I went out to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in California and spent 2 different trips, a week each. And I got more and more depressed, both with the subject, I guess, but also with the fact that I realized that Ronnie just, he wasn't a writer. He worked hard on his talking points, his speech notes, but there's no back and forth between his aides, memos about issues or how he made a decision, and there's very little personal correspondence. It was like, the empty vessel problem. And so I gave up and went back to Carter, which was a subject I had been interested in since 1990, when I did a magazine profile of him on what he was doing as an ex-president. But Carter was, when I got my first several interviews, I was disappointed with the interview process, because I didn't get very much out of him. He's written a lot of books. He's written 33 books, some very, very serious, very well-written books, a childhood memoir, a book about his mother. He's a good writer, but in an interview, he just wasn't a storyteller. I couldn't get him talking. He was not really, he was more focused on what he was doing, at the Carter Center, trying to eliminate guinea worm disease in Africa. He wasn't emotionally engaged in telling me about his presidency. He'd heard those questions 1,000 times before, so he was bored. But what became a breakthrough for this book, in my very first interview with him, I pointed out that I couldn't find in the archives any of the memos or letters, correspondence between him and his personal lawyer, a guy named Charlie Curbo. And I said, there's some, but I know from your own writings and from an oral history that Curbo gave many years ago, he claimed that there were hundreds of letters and memos that he wrote to you when you were president, and they're not in your presidential library. So Carter expressed surprise at this, and said, well, I'll investigate, I'll see. They should be someplace. And 3 days later, his personal assistant gave me a call and said, we found them. There are 5 boxes in the attic of Curbo's widow. And I guess because I'd asked the question, Carter gave me access to them 6 months later. They're still not in the archives, but they will be eventually. But they really made my book, because I could, quote from these letters from the one guy that he trusted, who he trusted could give him unvarnished advice, could tell him how to campaign, what his strategy should be on issues, on campaign strategy, but on major issues as well. And it's a revelation. You see Carter's thought process going on, and these letters are just, no one's ever seen them before. So it was an astonishing sort of breakthrough for me. I was so ecstatic when I got those 4 boxes. Anyway.
So you both work on very different kinds of books in some ways. You know, Candice works on what has been called a slice of life biography. Kai has worked on more traditional cradle to grave biography. But you know, the more deeply I get into this process, the more I realize that decision making is just, it's so important. You know, even when you are saying, okay, I'm going from beginning to end, it's chronological and starting with the birth and I'm ending with the death, you're still making choices. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about about research that you needed to know, but decided the reader didn't need to know, or just whole avenues that you decided, you know, that's just not for me. Maybe another biography will do this, but this is not, you know, this isn't my avenue to explore. Just some of your decision making about what ends up on the page.
So for me, probably a good example is when I was writing my second book, which is about the assassination of President Garfield. It actually began with me doing research on Alexander Graham Bell. So I had this first book that was set in the Amazon. I had worked at National Geographic for a number of years. I really liked writing about science, so I wanted another kind of science-heavy book. So I was just doing general research. I was researching Alexander Graham Bell among many other people. And then I came across this story of him sort of dropping everything, changing his life to try to save Garfield's life. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what Garfield was like. I had, you know, no interest in him, no knowledge about him other than the fact that he had been assassinated. And so I started researching him, and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy was incredible. He was brilliant. He was kind. He was brave, and he never should have died, right? His doctors killed him. So that became the story, but I was still really interested in Bell, and I thought it told you a lot about who Garfield was. That here's Bell. He's only 34 years old. He had invented the telephone just a few years earlier. He's famous. He's got some money. He's got time. He has a gazillion ideas, and he drops everything to do this. And I thought, it just tells you so much about who Garfield was and what he meant to the country at that time. And plus, he's just a fascinating figure in his own right. And it tells you a lot about what's going on in the country and the world at that time. So I've got the assassin, Charles Guiteau, his story going on. I've got Garfield's story going on. And then I've got Bell comes into it. And after the book came out, a number of people were like, why did you have Alexander Graham Bell in the book? You know, for some people, I think it felt like a distraction. Or people had said, why are you now going to do a book about Bell? And I understand that. But for me, for all the reasons I just said, it was important. And I think also because I began with him, but I did step back and examine it. And I thought it was important to keep him in there. I thought it really enriched the story, and I'm glad I did. And for the same reason, I would not now then go on to write a biography about Bell, because I've kind of said everything that I wanted to say about him, that I thought that was really, really interesting about him. So that was a decision that I had to make, and it also with the assassin. So with Garfield, so my editor said, why don't you start with the assassination? You know, it's kind of explosive and it's what people know about him and it'll draw people in. But to me, it was really important to get to know Garfield first, because that, you know, most people know nothing about him, or they think there's nothing interesting to know. They're like, oh, he's another Gilded Age bearded president. Like, what? Oh yeah, it's too bad he was assassinated. But I had through all the research, come to really, really respect him and feel like he would have been one of our great presidents had he lived. And so I wanted people to understand what kind of man he was so that they would care when it came. And then also so that they would worry. So I have the assassin, and you're learning about him, and he's starting to get more and more interested in Garfield and becoming obsessed with him. And then he thinks it's divine inspiration to kill the president. And here's Garfield going along, living his life. You care about him, and you want to say, turn around, somebody stop what's happening. So I wanted the reader to be engaged, to see what's happening that Garfield doesn't see, and you can see it coming and he can't. So those were decisions that, again, going back to why I outline, that's something I really, really thought about and put a lot of thought into how I want to structure this book and who's going to be important and to what degree.
So let me respond to that. I actually, ironically enough, I started off with Carter as a slice of life. I was going to do just the presidency, just 4 years. I thought that was the most interesting part of his life. And then when I did start to write, I started out with a little preface, prologue, I called it, about where this guy had come from. South Georgia, Plains, Southern Baptist, governor. And, I wrote like a 20-page prologue, and I was unhappy with it. It seemed thin. And then it grew to 40 pages. Then I split it into 2 chapters. Then, and I ended up writing 5 chapters on the pre-presidency. And so the book now is really the whole life. And the result of this was that, I talked myself into realizing that I couldn't write about his presidency without explaining and understanding where this guy had come from, the deep South, and to understand race and his religiosity, his Southern Baptist heritage. It all explained the presidency. So again, I had no outline. And I started out thinking I was going in one direction, and then the writing process just took me in another direction. It became a completely different book. I sold the book as just the presidency, and then I turned in a manuscript that is the whole life. There you go.
So a question about that kind of brings to mind to me, so many biographers have the experience of, stumbling upon either a source or a cache of letters or something very late in the process, something that's just been released or just been made public, and sometimes that can change everything, and means that you have to rewrite something, and makes you realize you didn't know the person exactly. Have either of you had that experience? And if so, how did you handle it?
I haven't had that experience where something came out. I have, as I said, realized that something was more important than I had at first thought it was when I was first organizing the book, and had to go back and do more research. For example, with the Garfield book, when I got ready, so I spent years researching it and organizing it, and I was actually writing, and I got to the point where I was writing about this induction balance that Alexander Graham Bell invented to try to find the bullet in Garfield, and I realized, I have pictures of it, I have descriptions of how it works. I had spent a lot of time working with archivists who really understood, early inventions, to understand how it worked and why it worked. But I didn't really know the physical object. I wanted to know, what are its dimensions? What kind of wood did he use? How heavy is it? All those kind of things. So I could describe it. And so I called, it's at the Smithsonian's American History Museum. and it's in the, you know, presidential assassination section, and they have it on display. And so I called to talk to somebody, and I was like, do you have any information about this kind of information about it? And they said, which one? And I said, what do you mean, which one? And they said, well, you know, Alexander Graham Bell donated every version that he made of this invention. And I was like, of course, he wouldn't just make one and that's the one, right? He's going to have all these prototypes and things. And they're like, yeah, he donated them to the museum, and we've had them in the basement, you know, since 1881. And do you want to see them? And I was like, absolutely, I want to see them. So I had to stop and go back to Washington, and you know, it was incredible. I'll never forget going to this basement, and they're bringing out box after box of these, you know, wires hanging down, different shapes and sizes. And I mean, it's what we were talking about earlier, you know, it's what's so great about doing research, all the research yourself, because you know, I holding these in my gloved hands very, very carefully. And you can just feel, you know, okay, this Bell, he's got the president's life on the line. He's got his own, you know, new reputation on the line. The world is watching, and his mind is racing, and his heart is thumping, and he's trying to figure this out. And it's just incredible. So, you know, I mean, did all of that get into the book? No, but it really helped me, again, to understand why Garfield was important, why Bell's an important part of the story. And it was just an incredible, incredible experience to see that.
Wow.
So here's a story from my Good Spy biography of the CIA officer. I actually started off that book thinking I couldn't do a biography, that it would just be a story about the Beirut embassy bombing of 1983. A history book about an event, a shocking truck bomb attack on a US embassy. But as I got into the research, I found more and more retired CIA officers who were willing to talk to me, and it became more and more biographical. And I found the widow, and she gave me a long weekend of interviews, and she talked about, she thought she had a suitcase of letters from Bob in her daughter's attic. Literally, the attic, the suitcase.
Always the attic.
It's always the attic.
And, you know, it took 6 months to find it, but when she did, she read through the letters, and some of them were very salacious, but she still gave them to me. And so that made the book biographical. And I wrote it, and along the way, I got to a point where I had a good sized finished manuscript of the whole book. But along the way, every CIA officer I talked to said, well, you know, you really can't tell Bob Ames's story without talking to Mustafa Zain, his sidekick, his sort of access agent, a Lebanese businessman who introduced him around the Middle East, gave him sources, introduced him to the PLO figure that made his career. And I looked for Mustafa. I thought he was in Florida. I had a retired CIA officer knock on the door of the apartment. No, Mustafa's gone. Finally, you know, I'm at the tail end of the book, and I get a message from a source saying, call this cell number. It's in Jordan. Mustafa will answer. And so I'm sitting actually writing this book for other reasons in Lima, Peru. So I get on Skype and I call this number and I say, is this Mustafa Zain? And he says, who wants to know? I explain who I am and I say, you know, a mutual friend gave me your number. And there was a long pause and he says, I've been waiting for this phone call for 30 years. And when are you coming to interview me? So literally 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Amman, Jordan, all the way from Lima, Peru. And I spent 10 days with Mustafa. exhausting days, 8 hours, 10 hours every day interviewing him. And he told me incredible stories. Just he was a storyteller and he remembered everything. He had letters, he had photographs. And by the time the 10 days were over, you know, my book was, my first draft manuscript was old hat. It was, so I had to spend 6 months, maybe 8 months completely rewriting the book to incorporate all this new material and verify what Mustafa had said. And it was, but it made the book what it is. It's, you know, so much better.
Wow. Always make the phone call also, like, and always, you know, hold out hope that you'll find that, you know, you'll be able to connect to that one person. Certainly I have people that I have tried many, many, many different ways of getting to, and I still hold out hope that it'll happen. Yeah. So we're near to the end here, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to, I'm going to look to chat. Full confession, I have not done this before, so I'm trying to see how I see your questions. But I'm going to do that right now. Does anyone have questions for Kai and Candice? Oh, someone's asking about hiring research assistants. Do either of you do that? Have you ever done it? What are instances in which that has worked for you or not?
I always hire a fact checker. So as I said, I worked at National Geographic. We had an amazing research department, but it was, you know, an after the fact research. So you would turn in your manuscript and they would make sure everything was right. So I know a lot of people who have since left that department, retired or whatever. And so I've usually used one of them. And obviously there are parts of the manuscript that they really can't fact check. You know, there are letters that, you know, they just won't have access to or things. And it really, and some of it, like, I know that this is correct. I did all the research, but there are things, you know, you can make mistakes that can be embarrassing. Like, you know, you describe a cobblestone streets and they didn't have cobblestone streets at that time, or what, you know, you can get a date wrong. You can get something, you know, especially like for me, I don't know a lot about military history and I've written about a couple of wars. So I want to make sure when I'm describing, you know, a gun or, you know, a military formation or something, that I'm not making an idiot of myself. You know, I can do everything I can, but I hire somebody just to double check. So what I do is I just take the manuscript and I just mark, you know, I just highlight, these are the places that I want you to fact check and just make sure I didn't make any mistakes. And I've done that every time.
Okay. Kai, have you ever worked with outside research help or?
Not really, no. And I guess I find it difficult to delegate archival research. And I wish I had hired a fact checker, because it is very laborious to go through your own manuscript 10 times looking for errors. I have at CUNY in the last couple of years on the Carter book, occasionally I hired a short-term researcher to find one specific thing, to track down a source I couldn't find, to track down an issue on that I was sort of stumped about. But I don't know, aside from my wife, Susan, who normally, you know, on all my previous other books, she was too busy to do anything to help, but she's now retired. So I persuaded her to come down to the Carter Library on one of my expeditions down there. And it was a very good thing, because she gained a new appreciation for how hard I've been working all these years.
Exactly.
And for 2 weeks, I got her to go sit at another table, get her own cart of archival boxes and go box by box and folder by folder. And, you know, after 7.5 hours, 8 hours of that every day, she stumbled out just completely exhausted. And it is very hard work. So she was very good at it, but I don't think I can trust anyone else to do that.
No, I agree. There's just too much that you can miss, or just there's certain things that you need, but there are a lot of things you just don't know. And if you find them, if somebody else found them, they wouldn't know to pass them on necessarily. And it might be, as I was saying, it might be something, really cool and really useful in some way. It's really hard to trust somebody else, I think.
We've had a couple of questions about Foia requests, and if people have filed those and what has come of them. Kai, you certainly have.
I have over the years. At one time in the late 1980s, when I was still working on McCloy, I think I had the record for the largest number of active Foia requests in at the State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA. I had hundreds, literally hundreds. I still have in my basement here a whole file cabinet filled with just the correspondence on the Foia requests and the appeals.
Wow.
And, I got a lot of stuff eventually, but it took years. And I really got so discouraged after the McCloy project that I filed a few Foia requests on my Bundy biography, but by the time I came along for the Oppenheimer project, Marty Sherwin, my co-author, had filed the Foia request to get his FBI file years earlier. And I filed some requests for my spy book on Robert Ames, and I never got a single document.
Wow.
I filed lots of not Foia requests, but mandatory review requests to the National Archives for withdrawal sheets that I saw in the Presidential Library or in the National Archives. You open a folder and you come across a dozen documents, and then suddenly there's a little sheet saying this document has been withdrawn from this folder. But it identifies it by date and how many pages it is. And so it's a very specific request, and it's called a mandatory review. And you can file those, and they process those pretty quickly. The archivist can do that. So I've gotten stuff that way, but it's very discouraging. The government just doesn't fund the Foia system. And it requires, if you file a request for a document written by the National Security Advisor to the President, and it's top secret, it has to be reviewed by a current working officer in the National Security Council. So that means somebody has to be seconded from, working on some crisis in the Middle East or Russia or whatnot to look at this silly Foia request. And, they're very conservative. Why get in trouble? Why risk your career as a civil servant and mistakenly release something that shouldn't be released in their view? So they often just say no. So it's a very discouraging process. And Obama, when he was president, instituted this 25-year rule where everything after 25 years should be considered declassifiable. But it still has to go through the process. And that means that the Defense Department or the CIA or the State Department has to allocate budget resources to hire people to look at each of those documents and stamp it declassified. And they just don't do that. So it's a broken system.
I'm going to try to do this answering the raised hand question. So there are two right now, and
Lindsay, I can manage that for you if you'd like.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
great.
I'll call on each person.
Okay.
People with raised hands.
Okay.
Ed Sullivan, you're up first.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
You're good.
Okay, I have my mic working again. Well, I have A question I have is, I'm a librarian by profession, so I always feel like I need to know everything about something before I proceed, I guess, from having that background. And I get my question to you is how, even when it comes to a slice of life biography, like you write, Candice, how do you know when you've done enough research? How do you know when you're ready to write? And do you begin writing before you've completed your research?
It is very hard to know. So like I said, you obviously you go in knowing that there are certain things that you need to know. But then when you start, and I said with my when I start outlining, I realize there are other things that I need to know. Even when I start writing, I find things like, I thought I had enough about this and I need to get more. So there's never a clear, like, okay, I'm totally done with research. But at some point you feel like, okay, I understand the story. I understand kind of the essence of who these central characters are. I've gone to all the major archives. I've gotten everything that I can. I've organized it, and I'm ready to start writing. And again, for me, I'm not ready to start writing until I've outlined the book. And so that's another step that might include some research. So it's always along the way. So I don't think, and I totally understand that question, because I love research. I always feel like there's more that I should know. There's always more that there will always be more that you can know. But it's kind of when you get to the point where, like, okay, I know how I'm going to tell this story, and I feel like I have a good, solid understanding of the plot lines and the characters, and then you're ready to get started. And just knowing if I need. So that's kind of the reassuring thing. If I need to do more research about something, I can do more research about it. It's not, the door has not closed.
It sounds like part of the process is intuitive.
Yeah, it's got to be. It's got to be. And I also think with the older I get and the more of these I've done, the more I realize that it's also very personal. Each of us, I as all of us, I'm a huge reader. I read a lot of biographies as well as writing some myself. And I love hearing somebody's voice in their biography and their writing. And it's not just their word choice or sentence structure. It's the way they approach the story, and it's down to each person. And I don't think you can successfully imitate somebody. We all have writers we admire, whose style we admire, and would like to maybe write in a similar fashion. But at the end of the day, you have to write the story the way you would write it. And I remember when I turned in my proposal for my first book, I remember my agent saying, you write like a man. And I was like, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. And it could have been largely because I'm writing about Theodore Roosevelt, this very masculine guy. But I think I just write it like Candice. That's kind of, I write my own way. And I think that it's a process kind of figuring. It's not like I start out like, this is my writing style. I don't know. I just, this is the way it makes sense to me to tell the story. And this is the kind of book that I would want to read. And so that's kind of what you learn about yourself. And that's why I think that the fact that Kai and I take years and years to finish a book, it might be frustrating for our editors. It might be difficult for other reasons, but you really get to know not just the story, but yourself as a writer, and there's parts that you just can't skip it. The shortcuts you can't take. You just have to kind of plow through it. The difficult parts, the sometimes really dreary parts of it, where you're taking pictures of things, or I'm typing my notes up. It's not glamorous and it's not fun, but it really teaches you a lot about not just the story, but about yourself as a writer.
Next up with the hand up is Susan Meyermull, looks like. There we go.
That's pretty good guess. I think my question, actually, you kind of addressed it, Candice, but just to ask it slightly more specifically, we get a lot of advice. I'm a first-time biographer, like, know why this is relevant now, know why you're presenting this character, know why. At what point in your work do you start knowing that and then go research reasons to support what you already know, or do you find that the more research you do, your question becomes clearer?
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, but it's the whole process is a learning process. I mean, you're always changing. I mean, even though, I might seem very regimented with my organizing and my outlining.
Oh, not at all.
Things move. Thank you. Things change all the time, and I'm always realizing well into the writing that doesn't belong there, that that's not clear, this person is not important, or this person is important. So it's always shifting and moving, and that I think it's really important. I was thinking earlier, one thing when Kai was saying he got this incredible gift of this amazing interview and he went and it changed everything. I mean, I think it's so tempting at that point where he already has a pretty good draft to just be like, it's great, I'll just kind of sprinkle a few. It's always worth it to take more time. Every manuscript, everything I've turned in has been at least a year late, at least a year late. And what I learned from my first one, it's much better, it's much more important that it be good than it be on time. That's hugely important, because I think I'm a rule follower and I'm like always like, I hate to be late for anything. And so I was completely stressed out with my first book, because I had told them I could write it in a year and a half, which is absurd. There's just like no way, and that's before I knew I was pregnant and everything. So it was just like, there's no conceivable way, but I didn't know. And then I'm like killing myself. And my husband, who had been a journalist with the New York Times, and he kind of knew the whole publishing world a lot better. He's like, it's okay. They're not going to like pull the contract. It's okay if you're late, just kind of let them know. And I'm not trying to be late. It's just, it takes longer than you think. And you can rush it and it won't be as good, or you can give it the time it needs. You can stop and make changes that it needs, so it will be a better book, and everybody's going to be happier in the long run. So just do that for yourself. Always, if you're confused, or if you like, oh, that was completely wrong, I need to go in a different direction, do it. Listen to your instincts and spend the extra time, because you will be so grateful. Because if not, like, I have a friend who did feel like she had to rush, and it was a good book, but she said, every time I pick up that book, I see all these things that I would change if I could. And she has to live with that right, for the rest of her life. So better to take the extra 6 months or a year, whatever it takes, to make it the book you want it to be, and that it can be.
Thank you.
Elaine Rock is up next.
That was a mistake. Go forward.
Oh, that was a mistake. Okay,
Yeah.
back to Lindsay then to cherry pick from the chat.
Okay, I am looking at the chat. I'm sorry. Okay. The last question, as a reader or writer of biography, what have you found to be the most convincing sources telling the story about a subject who did not leave diaries, papers, or much print documentation? Would interview help in this instance, government documents? If you are dealing with a source that didn't leave the kind of trail that you might be hoping for, what are other angles? I mean, Candice, you've said as much as that you've abandoned subjects that didn't have that information.
I bet this would be for Hyde. I think he would have really good thoughts on this one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure what we've talked about, going down a dead end alley and turning
Mm-hmm.
around and deciding there aren't the right sources.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked in my book about the CIA officer, there was very little archival material, but I found people, to my surprise, were willing to talk.
Mhm.
And one retired CIA spook would refer me to another, and each one would, legitimize my project in the eyes of other potential sources. But also, I have to say, one thing that really has changed since I started out in the 1980s being a biographer is, of course, the internet. And, I would spend hours and hours, hundreds of hours in the Library of Congress going on microfilm looking for New York Times articles. And now you can go online and do a word search, find a date, look at the front page of the Washington Post on the day that something crucial has happened to your subject. I mean, there's so much material out there, secondary sources, but also increasingly archival sources. There's something called, about 20 years ago, the CIA reluctantly agreed to try to collect all the documents that they had slowly released under the Freedom of Information Act over the years and put it in one resource called CREST. CREST, I forget what it stands for. And initially, you could only access these documents, they're tens of thousands of pages, on either a terminal in the National Archives building in College Park, Maryland, or in one of the designated presidential libraries. So when I first started out on Carter, you could go to this terminal in the Carter Library and you could do word searches, for Zbigniew Brzezinski or Menachem Begin. And up would come hundreds of cables, formerly classified cables that had been now declassified, and you could read the documents, copy them, take pictures of them. It was a very fast resource. Now all of that you can do online. So it's a new day for biographers in many ways.
I would just add also, as Kai does so brilliantly with all of his interviews, I mean, the people I write about are dead, and most of the people around them are dead usually, but I rely heavily on experts. They're always, especially if it's, a science heavy, there are always things that I don't really understand, or what I was explaining about the induction balance, things like that. And what I would say to people, if you're at all nervous about reaching out to an expert, when I was at National Geographic, I had to do it all the time, but I would call people up and say, hey, this is Candice Millard from National Geographic. Can I ask you some questions? And they would always say yes, because it was National Geographic, right? But then when I left to write my first book, and I needed a lot of expert advice and help, I was really worried, because I thought, well, it's a very different thing to call and say, hi, this is Candice Millard. Nothing, I got nothing. That's it. Just some person, right? Would you help me? Every single time they said yes. And not just yes, but like unbelievably generous with their time and their knowledge. And I'm not paying, I didn't pay them anything. They were just, and I would call, I mean, with Destiny of the Republic, there was one doctor I met through the Museum of Health and Medicine, and he was unbelievable. I mean, for years I called him with questions, and he pointed things out, like, because I'm like, well, I know he's like starving to death, and he's like, yeah, he's also unbelievably dehydrated. Oh, I didn't even think of it, So, and he read the biopsy, and he read, not the biopsy, but the, when they die and you go over. What's the word? my brain is autopsy. The autopsy.
Yeah.
The autopsy. He read that. He read all of the doctor's notes that happened for months and months. doctor was taking care of Garfield. So he was just incredibly generous with the time. And that happened with every single book. My book on Churchill, when I went to South Africa, and I wanted to understand, he's hiding in this mine shaft, this coal mine shaft with these rats. What was it like down there? What, I assumed that it was tight and dark, but no, I found these people who had worked at collieries in South Africa, in this part of South Africa, for years, and they said, no, actually, they're really wide tunnels down there because they put ponies down there for weeks at a time, these poor ponies, and so it smelled like pony feces down there. And so just like stuff I would never have known on my own. But they're happy, first of all, that somebody was interested in this subject they know and love, and was respectful and was trying to get it right. So never hesitate to reach out to people. I've never once had somebody say, no, I'm not going to help you. People are incredibly generous with their time. And, that's why I have huge acknowledgements at the back of my books. So I have so many people to thank.
Thank you so much, Candice, Kai. Thank you so much, Steve, for helping us in the room here. And thank you to everybody who contributed questions and everybody who watched. I hope everyone has a wonderful conference, and good luck.
Enjoyed it. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.